Poetry proceeds from silence. You have to be silent before you can train yourself to speak. And the big assumption is, if I speak and use the right words, the right holy names, then it'll all work. No, be silent.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. Today, we are so excited to chat about Goêtic and chthonic sorcery with magicians Frater and Craig Slee. So what is actual Goêtic, and how can this practice dissolve the barriers between everyday life and magical practice? What does it mean to see ourselves through a lens of radical otherness? Well, both of our guests are among the best people to ask. Frater is no stranger to the podcast. He is a lone practitioner of the magical and mystical path, and since 2009, he's been the author of theomagica.com, where he shares in-depth magical blog posts, essays, and other invaluable resources. And in 2020, he founded Para Librum, an online site that offers in-depth, independent reviews of bibliophile occulture. Frater is joined by Craig Slee, a writer, occasional poet, philosopher, and magician resident in the northwest of the UK. He often writes about the intersections of myth, magic, and disability. These two experienced practitioners, Frater and Craig, have joined forces along with illustrator Jose Gabriel Alegria Sabogal in their latest tome called Goêtic Atavisms from Hadean Press, as well as their excellent website, goetia.com, with this new, or shall we say, ancient re-examination of what it means to practice and embody chthonic sorcery. Also, a huge thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle supporter on Patreon for your amazing questions, support, and introspections as well. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome Frater and Craig Slee. Frater and Craig Slee, thank you both just so much for stopping on the podcast today.
Thank you for having us.
Same here. Thank you.
How did you both meet each other, and how did you end up collaborating with Jose in this wonderful latest book and website?
This book I started writing after I'd finished Ingenium as kind of the prior book before that. I began writing my side of the book, and we get to the two sides of the book later on, right afterwards, more or less. And the journey kind of that I was on from Holy Heretics into Ingenium, then into this book was clearly, it was like a star falling from the sky into the ground. You know, Holy Heretics is kind of a very mystical journey rooted into stealing the Christian fire. Ingenium was, I think, somewhere in the middle, really trying to help people establish an understanding of their inner tools of magic through a Paracelsian lens. And then after that, it was very clear to me I needed to go underground, really into the telluric space, and hopefully help people understand how this division into a celestial and a chthonic realm is actually wrong. And all of this on my end is a continuation of the exploration that I did with Paracelsus, because it was quite explicit in this, you know, and how you would find the underground space in the heaven and the heaven in the underground space. And it's all really woven into one. At that point, I really wanted to return to Austin Spare and his writings. And I wanted to weave my understanding of Spare into this book, because I do think a lot of his work is, of course, very embodied, is, you know, about the flesh, but it's therefore also quite chthonic in spirit. The whole notion of an atavism, you know, is very telluric. So that was my starting point of writing it. And I think I was a couple of chapters in, Craig, when we were talking, because we were talking anyway because of Para Librum and the book reviews there, and have had a couple of exchanges. And I just really adore Craig's writing, and, you know, was really trying to incentivize or push him and say, you know, you got to go beyond, you know, book reviews. This is so awesome. Like, I just really adore how your mind is working, and, you know, how radical your language is. And Craig, I think that was the start of the book then, as it stands today.
Yeah. I mean, Ark is not the only one who's been like, you need to write more. And my biggest issue is having not a framework to do stuff. I find myself going, I could go in any direction with a lot of the things that I write, even though they all spring from the same place. So we were having a discussion and we were talking about frameworks to go down into this sort of subject matter. And you came up with the idea of having a sort of call and response. And I'd shared a couple of essays with you. I think they're the first two in the book, if memory serves. And we sort of came up with the idea of we would share our material and sort of riff off each other and see what came up. And that's the book, bluntly.
Yeah. The book from the outset, at least on my end, needed to be rather radical. I just sensed that was kind of the direction that I wanted to go. That's also clearly the nature of the work that we find from Austin Spare. It's very radical in its visual nature. It's very radical in its textual nature. And so definitely I wanted to stay in that spirit. And then Craig and I beginning to, exchange not only ideas, but really texts. I think that worked really brilliantly. And, his texts really knocked me off center in terms of how he approached similar topics through a very different lens and got to very different points than I would get to. And, very quickly it became apparent to me, we got to keep these two texts separate, but combined. They need to come together, but they need to stand in their own right. And so this is kind of how we came up with the idea that this is a book that you can open from both sides. So you can open it from the left side and from the right side. And on the one side, you get Craig's essays, and on the other side, you get my essays. But it's really one book. Everything that we're exploring in that book, centers around the core of the chthonic realm and us as humans in that, and what that means from a Goêtic point of view of working.
One of the interesting points is we're obviously in different locations. We have our own different landscapes that we work with and are embodied within, and life experience, of course, and magical experience. So there is this very much a difference between my texts and Arka's texts, but I feel like because they both emerge from being embedded in the ground in that chthonic context, readers and anybody with magical experience of that area will be able to see the roots. We mentioned radical, and radical is roots, radix, and so this is very much, from my perspective, about saying, okay, how do we experience and move in the world in a way that reaches down to the roots of who and what we are? And that has interesting implications for what the Goês is, rather than simply somebody in a magical circle or doing traditional ceremonial magic, or in quotes.
Craig, you were mentioning that you and Frater are, bringing together this material. Can you share a little bit about your path, your connections with, chthonic sorcery, and just how everything blossomed for you personally on your esoteric journey?
Sure. I mean, I've been at this for 20 years now. My own experience is I'm a disabled wheelchair user. My original background was in chaos magic. So I spent a lot of my time looking at magical traditions and a lot of these rituals and going, okay, rather than stripping this down to some baseline, I have an experience where half of these ritual postures and gestures and things like that, I can't do them. So one of the big questions was, for me, does this just mean I can't do magic and can't have these experiences? And I had the experiences which said, that's not true. There's other ways of doing this, other ways that aren't perhaps, even the chaos magic traditional ways. There are other ways of dealing with the things that you encounter. And for me, one of the primary ethoses is, and I have to thank Frater for sort of laying this out for me in about, I think it must have been about 2009, was to say, if you had no tools, if you had nothing but your own body and you were stuck, absolutely stuck, and you actually had no training. So in a sense, if you were the first magician that ever existed, how would you do this? How would you use what you had, i.e. your own body and your own mind, to relate to the world, this world full of magical, demonic entities and spirits? And that was always my ethos from day one. And from that, I encountered various spirit contacts, for want of a better word, which led me down certain paths. And they all tended to lead to this whole idea of essentially not some transcendental, distant, or even mental realm, but this very grounded, almost ancestral angle. So I started experiencing the landscape of both where I grew up and where I live now, which is 300 miles away, and the local spirits of those places as they moved with and through me. And then through developing those relationships, I was like, oh, okay, I'm kind of embedded in this tradition, which isn't a tradition, but it feels like some sort of continuity. And then I encountered Geosophia, and I was like, oh, there's another tradition. So I encountered Jake's work, Jake Stratton-Kent. And I was like, oh, he's laid out the actual historical context for this. And the rest is history, I suppose.
You dedicate the material on the website and, of course, with Goêtic Atavisms, quote, in memory of the spirit and work of Paracelsus, Austin Osman Spare, and Jake Stratton-Kent. Can you share about the importance of each of these three figures and why you dedicated the material in memory of each of those?
Yeah, happy to start from my end. And there's a chapter in the book where I take the liberty to compare much of the Western ritual magic tradition as we encounter it today, mostly in books, maybe some orders, to Western pornography. And it's a drastic comparison, obviously, but the idea is to say both of it is a theater. Both of it is a spectacle. Both of it is arranged according to certain rules. Both of it has an expected narrative. Both of it has roles for visible and invisible participants. And, both of it has a desired and specific outcome. And if that outcome doesn't fulfill itself, then you disappoint genre expectations. And then, in the book, I go on to, hopefully open a pathway that leads out of this pornographic debacle. Not to say that pornography, is something morally wrong at all. If all parties agree, then, good luck. But for what we are trying to achieve in Goetic magic or Goetia is very, very unhelpful. This underpinning script is very unhelpful. It's the opposite, if you want, of what we're trying to achieve here. We're trying to achieve intimacy. We're trying to achieve a kind of eroticism. And again, that doesn't necessarily need to have a sexual connotation, but it can. And when you look at these three names, Paracelsus, Austin Spare, Jake Stratton-Kent, and then you look at their work, and they all radically, vehemently break these notions that would be similar between pornography and Western ritual magic. They're absolute radical in how they forge their own path and connect with something that is unscripted, something that is a momentary, genuine encounter that you have as a person, and my encounter of it might be slightly different. And all the courage, the life experience, the radicalness that it takes to even open up this path and set the first step out on it that is part of the Goetic notion of this book. But that's really, I think, part of the fire that, I feel is passed on to me, passed on to us from people like Paracelsus, Jake Stretton-Kent, Spare. There are, of course, others as well, but I think these were the three for whom I felt kind of the giants on which shoulders you stand.
I think I would agree with that. And I would also say that there is a bit where I talk about the fact that Spare in the 1940s, his flat was bombed out. He lost the use of his hand. This is somebody who, that was how he lived. That was how he ate. That was literally how he survived. And, many people would say, oh, yes, well, he managed to heal and fix himself. But you look at Spare's life, and he was not a rich man. He was not, he turned his back on the high art world, in a sense, to create these depictions and sensings of a world full of what he would call, these satyrs, all these images that we have seen. And he would also paint pictures of working class folks. There's the semi-apocryphal story that Hitler himself was, fond of Spare's work. And he asked, because Spare was a good artist, he wanted to paint it. And then, Spare said, no, this is before the war. And there is this very real sense of earthiness in what we would term ugliness, So to take Arka's point about pornography is very perfected. It's all about the image. It's all about the looking a particular way. And that, to me, that's not how the world is, right? And Jake Stretton-Kent's work was all about, hey, there is this thing underneath, and it's not pretty. It's not high magic.
It's not a product.
Exactly. It's not part of the marketplace in the sense of a thing you can just pick and choose and put down. Spare lived his life through a deliberate choice. Paracelsus had his urge to go out in the world and understand it as it really was, not how the doctors and metaphysicians of his day said, this is how the world is. So there is this very real impetus, I feel, and we talk about it in both our sections of the book, actually, of not accepting your first impressions and immediately connecting that to what you know intellectually, to what you think it should be, and actually sitting there and refusing that first impression and allowing what else is there. So you look at a tree, as an example, and we instinctively look at a tree and go, oh, that's a tree. We don't actually sit and look at that being, that object, and allow it to come to us. Neither do we set up a scenario wherein we arrange things generally to allow that tree to come and meet us as it will. And one of the things that has always fascinated me about Jake's work was his uncompromising urge to, as I think he would put it, burn his fingers, to say, okay, rather than just reading what the book says, I'm going to go out and do it. I'm going to go out and experience it. I'm going to go out and feel and experience the world. And that changes our notions of influence, power and influence, and had something, I guess, closer to, and I hate the word, but I'll use it because your listeners are probably aware of it, an animist viewpoint wherein the world can influence us. We're not just the only active agents. And I think those three figures that we have dedicated this work to in general were, in a sense, very much aware that the world itself was influential. The idea that one could take certain substances and have certain experiences, change one's body, which is medicine, essentially. Applying certain substances changes the bodily experience, which Paracelsus was all about, is something that is, I would say, lost in an insulated, commodified world. And I don't think, even though Spare is now fated once again as this great artist, he turned his back on that commodification. And, you can see the punk going all the way through Jake's work. And so there's that wonderful dovetailing underneath the surface where I think they all link.
Given that there's an intimacy here, there is a direct appreciation and exchange with these beings, and there should be much less of an emphasis on the performative aspect. Could each of you share what is your definition of Goetia? Because you mentioned on the website, for example, that it's not a good term for the type of chthonic sorcery we want to call into your life here, but it's the best we could find. And then in addition to your definition of what Goetia is, can you share about a big theme in your writings, which is that intimacy, the human being is connected in a web, the human being envisioned metaphorically as a landslide, just kind of careening down the slope. Can each of you just kind of elaborate on those powerful themes that you write about?
So my definition, I hate giving definitions because fundamentally this work and this life spills over definitions. But having said that, I would say, and I reserve the right to change this the next time somebody asks me, I would say that Goetia is that which the Goes does when they are fully in their own maximal daimonic relationship with a living cosmos. So when the daimon or the practitioner has cracked open that human insulation and become as the tree. I mean, I quote, lived like a tree walking from Spare. When we are once again in that relationality with those living daimonic processes and perform certain things to produce change and participation in the world. So it's a woolly definition, but all of this is woolly. And the sheer interdependence of this is the key point. So we bring up the avalanche notion, but what's interesting about an avalanche is all it takes is one tiny pebble. We see the mountain sliding vast with all these rocks, but actually all it takes is this tiny pebble to tip it over and start that slide. And in that case, it is not about summoning the avalanche. No, it's about looking at the side of the mountain and going, if I just nudge that bit, if I relate to that one pebble, then bang. The idea that the practitioner is one thing is something we're pushing against. That there is a larger version of personhood than a singular entity. And we are composed also of the interplay of those multiple currents, flows, diamonds, whatever you want to call it.
I would say the same in my own words. Many of us might know the TV series The Mandalorian. And in it, they so heroically often say, well, this is the way. And I would say what we're trying to revive with this notion of Goetia is the exact opposite. Because when they say this is the way, they subscribe to a code. And you trespass over that code and you lose your identity. And that's the exact opposite of what we're describing here. Let me use an example from the natural world. Imagine you as a person are a piece of moss, in a large piece of moss covering the floor in a forest. And imagine, the moss kind of is split up into small cells, and each of these cells say to each other, well, this is the way. This is the moss way. This is how we do things. This is how we kind of cover the ground floor and how we connect with fungi and mushrooms and spores and all. This is the way. But you happen to be that piece of the moss that just slightly hangs over into a lake. And so your experience is just slightly different because you hang over into this lake and you say, well, that way really sucks for me because the way you deal with, water and everything, that just isn't my experience. It just doesn't work. So it's in that spirit that I would throw out of the window the idea, this is the way. To find the way is your life's challenge. And you can observe other people's ways. You do not stop being part of this overarching blanket of moss. You're still woven into that. But the key trick for this piece of moss that I'm talking about is to develop a relationship with a lake and to understand what it is to be a lake. Now, a lake is so radically different from a piece of moss that it will challenge the moss to its core ground to understand the lake. Now, the moss's understanding of the lake is not an intellectual process. It is not something, okay, let's open the school books and look up what a lake might be. And then maybe what happens is the moss kisses the lake. And it's in that kiss that they encounter each other, the moss and the lake. And it's through every touch between them that they die a little and that they revive each other a little. And that's the notion of Goetia. We're all being woven into the tapestry of being humans. We all share that. And there are certain things, that are the way as being humans. We all go and take a dump and we all, brush our teeth, and that is very human. But are you the one who's touching the lake? Or are you the one who is touching the rock? What is your experience? And who are you kissing right now? And where are you dying a little? And where are you being revived a little? So I would totally go back to, Craig, how Frater UD challenged you, to think of the world as if you were the first magician. And the more I spend time in this Goetic paradigm, the more I feel we just really need to start from scratch. Just kind of get rid of everything that you think you knew about magic and how it works in the West, how it's been codified in the West over the last 700 years. All of these books are at least as much of a hindrance as they are support. And so the deeper I delve into this Goetic work notion, I actually think the more radical it becomes, and the more it becomes what Frater UD said to you, Craig, think of yourself as the first magician and you're standing there naked, empty-handed, maybe without the possibility to move. So how will you now kiss the lake? How will you now encounter what's around you?
Yeah, and I think, I've got to make it clear here. This is not about, oh, well, I think I should do this. Or, okay, I'm ripping up the books and I like the idea of doing this or that, or so on and so forth, because I think it's cool or it makes you feel comfortable. If you're the first magician, you're going to be deeply uncomfortable. And in fact, part of that is to go, hey, I'm actually going to have to look at the world as it is. I'm not going to have any illusions that these spirits are all my friends. Some of them, I need to keep them the hell away from me. Some of them will be friendly if I do this. Some bits of the lake, there's moss-eating, fish. Some bits of the lake, there are fish that eat the moss-eating fish. So as moss, maybe I should, make a pact with the fish that eat the predators. Or, there is very much this point where you have to, or I believe anyway, one has to look at one's, baseline assumptions about what human is, about how you move through the world. I mean, this is one of the things. I have a different kenning of the world, a different intimate knowledge of the world than somebody who is bipedal, because I use a wheelchair, right? So I can feel slopes and divots in pavements or pathways or grass that people who are walking on feet may not, right? So I have a completely different experience and a completely different way of moving through the world. This doesn't mean mine's better, but it does mean that it's different. And sitting and looking or experiencing the world and going, okay, now what?
Craig, if I can intersect there, we talk so much about this notion of otherness and radical otherness even. And what that really is, otherness is the moss looking at itself through the eyes of the lake. And suddenly seeing, holy shit, that looks really terrible. Like when you look at me through the eyes of the lake, like I'm totally fucked up. Like, and I'm just this little thing. And oh my God, I'm so fragile, and a single match or whatever might come, a human might come and just rip me apart. And what you just described so well, Craig, about, the experience of being with a wheelchair out in the park and how you will experience the park. And then me maybe walking next to you and experiencing it on 2 feet, in that moment, realizing how incredibly fragile and conditioned and almost random the experience is that you're having of this park. And in that moment, being scared of yourself because you realize this thing that I always, wear as a meat suit or as whatever, or, that I always touch as a wheelchair or the shoes, this is really deeply foreign, because in that moment you realize how different it could be and how random the circumstances are that it turned out in this way. So if you can look at yourself like the lake would look at the moss looks at the lake, but you reverse perspectives and, you get to this moment where you become deeply uncanny to yourself. In my eyes, that's a precondition to do what Craig described earlier, as in taking a really animistic perspective and allowing yourself to be influenced by the world.
I think this leads perfectly into a question for both of you from a listener, Ashley J. And Ashley is asking and saying, speaking of this theme of what it means to be with physicality, I am so excited Frater and Craig are coming on the podcast. My question is, could both Frater and Craig elaborate on what they say about the physicality of Goetia in their new book? That quote, in this book, we are venturing to make Goetia flesh, to bring it forth in your flesh. That is, Goetia is an explicitly physical form of magic, unquote.
So I think first things first, what Arka described there about seeing yourself as the moss, this fundamentally requires a change in your consciousness, right? A literal change, not just in your perspective, but if you repeat it enough, you start literally changing your entire sense of awareness. And what's interesting about that is we're not drawing a distinction here between the mind and the body. One of the things that is key in my section of the book is that literally the posture of your body will alter how you think, right? So if you're feeling tense, that alters the kind of thoughts you think. If you are experiencing the world with COVID or flu, you might have fever dreams, right? And those fever dreams could be, magical. Arka has a whole section about the veil of the myrmidones and lying still while asleep, or rather after sleeping, and how that changes your mind. So there is this angle that we are taking wherein the flesh and the consciousness are inextricably linked. So there is a somewhat tradition in Western magic of mind palaces and, places like that, and a lot of mental projections. And a lot of those texts or techniques, they kind of say, yes, well, the mental realm is higher or less gross or so on and so forth. And one of the things that I am disagreeing with that angle is that those mental places are completely inextricably linked from the thickness of the flesh. And indeed, one of the great points is that the flesh is the prime surface by which we sense the world. Our skin, the way breezes play over that. You know, we talk about, oh yes, we see, we hear. All of that is because there are literal particles or vibrations, you know, in our flesh, right? And so much of Western magic, either it's about avoiding the body or shaping the body into one particular position. And from my perspective, I don't have total control over my own body. Like, nobody does, but I especially don't have control, in inverted commas, over my own body. So working with my flesh, rather than trying to force both body and mind into some ideal, and then using or experiencing to its fullest extent and sort of refining what I sense through flesh, again, comes back to that image of not just assuming that a tree is a trick.
In the book, and in a prior book, I define Goetia as a relational craft. And so the emphasis of the body is also opportunistic because it just makes sense to start the relation there. You know, it is a thing that's very close to you. I go back to this idea of the moss. Let's imagine a piece of moss that somehow, by, cosmic accident, was gifted human intelligence. Now we kind of step close to this little piece of moss that now has human intelligence, and we press our ear closely to it, and what we hear is the moss lamenting about its mossiness, saying, "Oh my God, if only these fishes weren't nibbling at us, and oh, if it only wasn't that wet, and oh my God, our mossiness is really the worst thing about us because we're so terribly intelligent. If only somebody could free us from our mossiness." And that's a little bit the state that I think we as humans have brought us into over the last 2,000 years for sure. That, much of our lament is about the actual things that we should have an erotic relationship with. Not because they're necessarily nice, just like the fishes are nibbling at the moss, so death is nibbling, on our bodies, but it's a reality. So how can we develop an erotic relationship even with the things that undermine us, even with the things that fragment us, and not step away from them, but step into them? And that's why the emphasis of the body, the chthonic, the telluric, is the most important starting point, because none of us starts in the stars. None of us starts in the lake. We all start in our own mossiness.
I think this goes to such a powerful point that you both touch on too, which is, and I love this phrase, Goetic common sense. And there might be people out there wondering, oh my gosh, like this is such a powerful interpretation. This is a really great way to approach chthonic sorcery. Can each of you share what is Goetic common sense, and what are some things that you really want the listeners and readers of your book to keep in mind from a quote unquote common sense level?
Craig, if you don't mind me starting.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the best way to explain it is to actually read the little booklet that I wrote that is called Goetic Common Sense. It's out there for free for download on the webpage. So that will help you dive into it for sure. But, I think start with common sense, and with common sense, I don't mean necessarily everyday logic, that other people help you believe. It's not habits. It's not cultural habits. That's not what it is. But if you needed to explain someone how to clip their nails, you would probably use a lot of common sense in how you would approach the subject. So you wouldn't make it a theoretical exercise. You wouldn't kind of go into abstractions. You would say, okay, let's take a really sharp scissor and here's how you do it and don't cut yourself and blah, blah, blah. And we're trying to take the same approach to encountering spirits. and working with spirits and partaking in spiritness. Not make it overly complicated, but go back to things that are very rooted in us being humans. Craig, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think it ties in to precisely what you were saying about becoming, if I can paraphrase, sort of a stranger to yourself and looking at your relation in the world and how you relate in the world and saying, okay, what is common, right? What is common between the moss and the lake? What is shared? What forms of kinship do we have? Mm-hmm. And this is where we sort of move into almost an ancestral idea that you can be kin to a rock, to a mountain, and that these landscapes can birth you, right? And you are nourished by them. So this kinship idea, which is a very human thing, to relate to other people as our folks, right? Understanding that a tree that you pass every day may turn around in some world and go, yes, oh yes, that's my human, and think about what that might do. There is a great commons in the sense of living entities, daimons, which are constantly operating together. And it's common sense to be like, okay, humans are wired as social creatures, right? If we are wired as social creatures, as if we are wired to relate, then therefore it is common sense, to me at least, to operate within a framework wherein essentially even our tools are not one way. They don't just exist for us. On the website it says, tools as aids of perceiving. And what we've got here is that's a really interesting phrase, because the assumption we usually have is, oh yes, those tools enable us to do X, Y, and Z, right? But if we look at that phrase and think aid, help, right? And those tools have an agency which helps us, right? So our tools affect us. When you're building a talisman, right? When you're gathering all the influences and agencies into building your talisman, whether that be Stellar or, any of these others, those influences are affecting you. In fact, when the talisman is complete, is built, it acts upon you as you are building it, as you are working with it, right? It's not just something you made and you can send out and it's not connected to you anymore. It reverberates back. So when you hold a tool, if you're going to be holding a knife or a ritual knife or a magical sword or whatever, yes, you're gripping that sword, but the shape of that sword is influencing how you're holding it. So again, there is this idea that the things which seemingly are outside us influence us internally and vice versa. And that's common sense. People think it's ridiculous, but kids will tell you. Kids will, if we could in some way go back to being kids and treat those not as things to grow out of, but actually have that same level of, oh yeah, the TV's saying, doing this, it does this. There's this idea that the world is dead, that it can't influence us unless we summon entities into them. What if those entities are already there and it's just our job to alter our consciousness to relate to them? So it's not like, oh yeah, we don't do any preparation. They're just there and we can take it as read. No, we have to prepare ourselves to receive relationships. with those entities. And we have to do things that might actually make them want to talk to us. This is the thing. You could command them with force, perhaps a more powerful entity if you wanted to do that, to encourage them to talk and relate to you. Or you could perhaps leave offerings. You could perhaps do this. You could perhaps do that. The key point is always about relating and kinship, which is human common sense, because we're not alone. Humans never were.
And maybe just one more comment, the term common sense in this particular context, I think goes back to some anthropological writings that I refer to in sociological writings that I refer to in the article or the book. What's really important to point out is that common sense is conditional. Common sense relates to a particular culture. So if you immerse yourself together with Craig and myself and whoever else wants to into this Goetic current and this realm, then the things that we're describing are emerging as common sense. If you immerse yourself into a different current, different things will emerge as common sense. You travel to Japan from where I live, and their notion of common sense will be quite different on many things than, where I live. So there's nothing absolute in this, but there's something relatively practical in comparison to the path that you're trying to walk. Nobody walks an absolute path. We're all walking a conditional path.
That's another thing that I think is valuable. Just want to say this. There's a difference between intellectual knowledge and direct, intimate knowledge. We would say, I know Acher. I don't know him intellectually, but I have a knowing of him. I mean, German has the difference with conditional knowledge. I can't remember the exact difference, but certainly it's kennen and what's the other one?
Wissen, kennen.
Wissen and kennen. They're two different modes of experience and knowledge. And what we're trying to lean into, I think, is the kennen, the kenning. And in English, we have a phrase which isn't used much, but if we say something is beyond our ken, what we really mean is it is beyond our intimate acquaintance, our intimate relation, right? And so kenning is the common sense of relation in the way that we live and the way that we are. So kenning in Japan might produce different experiences to kenning in Germany or kenning in the UK.
I love this encouragement that you both have for people to truly, in the Jake Stratton Kentian sense, to get your fingers burned in this new book and on the website. And I think this leads to a question that we have for both of you from listener JT Lopez, just speaking of death and big picture meaning, the laws of meaning. JT Lopez is asking, do either of you, Frater Acher or Craig, hold an eschatological belief about the future of humankind?
I think short answer is no. I think what I know about the future is that I'm going to have chocolate for dessert this afternoon, but it really doesn't extend beyond that. Quite frankly, in my day job, which is in the industry, I realize how little we actually control. Most of the terrors that I see, most of the suffering that I see is born out of stupidity and just happenstance and people not seeing it around the corner. And, most of the action is just really aimed at the next 5 seconds rather than the next 5 years or so. So, no, I do not have any outlook, I would say, in terms of how things might develop spiritually or, on a mundane level either. I try to firmly stay in the presence. And, a lot of what we said about relationships and body and, your body only exists in the present tense.
I would say as well, your body only exists in the present tense now. And it also extends in all directions. So one of the key points for me is, in answer directly to that question, I have lots and lots of eschatological beliefs, but they're all contradictory. I have absolutely no idea what's coming around the corner. So I focus on the now, because by focusing on the now, you can, humans have these anticipatory systems. We like to try and predict what's coming next, because that way we might evaluate threats or learn how to deal with what's coming next. But if we're always looking ahead to the next thing and we're not paying attention to what's actually going on now, then we miss the subtle flows and shifts that might say, for example, we lose the ability to be able to look at the sky and go, oof, the clouds overhead have shifted, right? If we're looking at the map and we're seeing all the meteorological stuff that the Met Office in the UK or wherever are telling us, oh, in, 2 days, we're going to have a rainstorm or something, we start trusting that rather than going outside, looking at the sky, looking at the ground, and sitting there and feeling the literal atmosphere around us. So when I say I have lots of these eschatological ideas, they're just projections. They're just dreams that may never come to be. But what I'm focusing on is the now, right? What I'm focusing on is these, living and trying to live well in the reality that I'm experiencing, not these potential projections of future, right? And one of the things that I borrow from an author and a speaker called Bayo Akamalafi is this idea that prophecy is looking again, right? So basically taking what is familiar and looking at it again and seeing what we didn't notice, and then following what we didn't notice. So any sort of end times or ways humanity is going to end up, they make no sense unless we study what is here and now and with us. Because a lot of the time we think we're in an empty room, to use a metaphor, and we're not. That room is full of stuff and presences and things. And if we're always trying to get out of the room and not study it and not experience what's going on, you get lost in a pipe dream, frankly. And that's where the stupidity comes in, because you're going to end up walking into a wall if you're busy trying to, not pay attention. So all of this is about paying attention, essentially.
And you mentioned contradictions. It reminded me of that lovely phrase from Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then. I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. And I just think that this is such a wonderful call that you both are having in this book about containing the multitudes and becoming familiar with them. And I think based on what you just said, we have a follow-up from JT Lopez. JT is asking and saying, what developments in Western esotericism would you both like to see happen in the near future? And then what about the further future? Let's say your children's generations. And that's JT's question. And if I may add on to that, based on what you both said about the importance of the present moment and not looking, say, ahead to the future, only the future, would it be safe to say that perhaps one of the keys is to embody this eternal present and really the way to achieve a future with esoteric developments that you both might want to see for future generations is to ironically not focus on the future, to focus on the present and what we have. But I'll turn it over to both of you. What do you think?
I think the most immediate esoteric development that I'd love to see is for many people to buy that book because it's really good. No, honestly, again, I think this is leading, slightly into the future, and I really try not to spend too much time on that or speculate. When I look at what's pissing me off these days, the things that I'm angry about, or that, ideally I would hope they would go away, is, still a lot of the Christian influence and the two-facedness of morality. What pisses me off is my own and other people's inability to endure ambiguity. A lot of people are practicing magic to have straighter answers, and yet if you practice magic, you get lots more problems, not straighter answers. So I think humans' inability to accept their softness in this world, their mossiness, and that they're squeezed by any hair running over it or deer, that's really pissing me off, because it normally leads to short-sighted counter reactions that, kind of creates pipe dreams for the moss to become the ruler of the forest and, subvert the entire forest to its mossiness. These things piss me off, but hey, the world isn't here to not piss me off, so that's fine. Do I think that will ever change, either in the esoteric community or not? I don't think so. The esoteric community is just a subset of the human community. We share all these same features. I think the one hope maybe that kind of overarches all of this is that people start practicing magic more again without a theological framework, without terms, without being caught up in the idea of, I'm conjuring an angel, or I'm conjuring a demon, or I'm conjuring, let's leave away all these phrases. Let's just see what comes to the foreground when you approach it without words. That, I think, would be fantastic. But again, I think that rubs off against a lot of human preferences to have certainty, clarity, to make sure that rituals are repeatable and all of that.
Yeah, I think this may be heresy for some, but I think we need to, and I can't even remember the quote, which is how much I hate it. The quote Crowley has about the aims of science and religion. Because I genuinely think, right, that this obsession with repeatability and is extractive. It treats the world as a thing where you push a button and X happens, and you keep pushing the button and X happens. And relationships to the world are solely about getting what you think you want, or getting what you're told you want. And one of the key developments I would really like Western esotericism to really have a self-analysis about is this obsession with finding the way, finding the Mandalorian, right? Because not to invoke the specter of the good and noble indigenous person having a better reality than us, moribund Westerners, etc. But the fact is that all of these cultures which have survived, damaged by colonialism, let's be honest, but, nonetheless, they have survived. They work with their environment. They steward, because these landscapes, these places are part of them. And one of the key points for me is we need to interrogate the very Western idea of the self. We need to interrogate the idea of, and I'm not talking about, necessarily all going Buddhist, shall we say, but we really need to interrogate this notion of the I, right, as in the singular I, because I, feel that's essentially part of the overarching project that has got us both in Western occultism and in wider culture in this mess when it comes to the planet, whatever you may think about that, is the idea that we are not connected, that we're not already part of a multiplicity, right? And that we are not multiplicities in and of ourselves. So, to borrow from the Whitman, yes, contradictions, multitudes. If we as Western esoteric folks say, look, I am not going to be this singular thing, and explore what that means rather than taking it as read, and really understanding that things like healing and light and all these things are not universals. They are conditional. So I'm disabled. There are plenty of people in the world who are like, oh, we want to fix your disability, right? We want to eradicate sickness, illness, death. In the same way that the Western esoteric community is like, oh, I only do light work, or I only work left-hand path. There's this real commitment to these intellectual constructs, these theologies, these cosmologies, perhaps, of particular ways. And rather than going, actually, if it's all conditional, then that means what healing for me might look like is not necessarily healing for you. And this doesn't mean there isn't a way to live that is right. What it does mean is that what finding that way is influenced by things other than ourselves, right? So we don't always get to choose. Sometimes things choose for us. And learning to turn to those choices which we have no control over and work with them to maximize a life for ourselves and others around us. That's what I really like, because I find Western esotericism, it's kind of selfish. It's genuinely a kind of, in certain senses, a personal self-development thing. I think it should be broader than that. It is broader than that, despite what the market may tell you.
We do have a listener question for you, Frater Acher, from Scott from Tacoma. And Scott is saying, Frater Acher, it seems just like last week I was hastily getting my pre-order in for Holy Heretics. My winding question probably has several of my personal misconceptions in it, but here it goes. To backtrack a little, the Olympic spirits have been described as blind forces and also as something analogous to the familiars of the planets. I suppose this might mean that they affect us in a more visceral way. Paracelsus via you also has described them in terms of their negative aspects, that they are ailments in our lives. In your adaptation of the Arbitel, there is a request to the Olympic spirits to grant their 7 living lights into our sphere of sensation. It's from here my question comes in, Scott says. How do these 7 living lights work to alchemize in our sphere? Do they stabilize eventually and then a cleansing of the ingenium begins? Ingenium being the facility of spiritual communion. This whole process seems to be an act of initiatic theurgy. So furthermore, how do we go from this metaphysical approach of becoming to a more chthonic lens? It seems to me, Scott says, that the Paracelsian work is more goal-oriented, and after achieving some level, the focus becomes more about living more deeply and fully in an animistic environment. It does resonate with me for the mystical aspect to come first. I would love to hear your comments on that bridge aspect after the attainment of the goal and before what comes next. Thank you very much, Frater.
Yeah, thank you. When I read that question, I thought, fuck, that's such an awesome question. Scott has read so thoroughly and carefully and pieced this together. I should write a book to answer that. And then I was like, hang on, I've already written a book. So I think the question is spot on. It's about the nature of the Olympic spirits, how they weave within us, how they can create diseases or healing, and how they're combined or connected into the chthonic experience. Holy Heretics, I think, in the second part, provides a really radical ritual, which I hope for the people who are attempt to undertake it, it remains theurgy and not theater. That ritual is meant to turn the mirror within you and to allow you to look the Olympic spirits into the face. And that's a really important alchemical process, if you want. Lots of homeopathy, when you use it, you actually use the component that you already have an excess of. So if you have an excess of something in your body, then you add that, through drops or whichever way of ingredient to your body. And then your body realizes, oh, this is what I actually have too much on. And then it looks in the face and can modulate and change it. And this work with the Olympic spirits works very similar. It allows you and the Olympic spirits within your own body to look each other in the face and realize, oh, this is us, back to this multitude thing. And then the Goêtic Atavism book, goes right into the heart of, how does this then all tie and come to life in a telluric environment? I have one more book to get out, which is finished. That's the Olympic Spirits book. And in that book, in the second part of it, I provide a reconstruction of the master seal of the Arbitel in how I think one can work with it with lots of common sense. And so that will come out in spring next year and hopefully then complete the circle.
You've already brought up so many misconceptions, both of you have, that people may have in the back of their head. I just need the tools. This is a gumball machine, and I press something and I will always get the same results. We never change. Spirits never change. Relationships should be the exact same thing. I mean, you have broken so many misconceptions, but I'd love to hear from both of you in Goêtic Atavisms and also in this discussion today. What are some other misconceptions that we haven't discussed yet that you think when listeners pick up your book, when readers start going through it, when they start practicing, what are a few misconceptions that maybe you've had to chat with people about that might be in the back of their minds that you would just like to flag for them, if you will?
So the biggest misconception for me, bar none, is that it is possible to do nothing. And what I mean by this is that we exist in the world and are constantly shifting and changing. This means that for me, Goetia is not about big, huge rituals. At its core, it's not about 14-day fasts and X, Y, and Z and all these prohibitions. It is about the small, unnoticed thing. And one of the issues I see is that people do not see the nuances and depths that small things have, right? So once you start this, you can't go home again. You genuinely can't go home. This is not something you can pick up and put down. It'll change you. This is not something that can be treated as just a hobby. It starts to infect. And I use the word infect, and there's no moral judgment here, but it is an infection, every aspect of your life and your relationships. And the key point for me for that is people go into this thinking they're going to be the same. They're just going to have superpowers. That's just not true. You may gain things that will make you different to other people, but you won't be just where you started plus. You'll go off on this crooked path somewhere and be changed. And ultimately, I don't want to frighten people and be like, oh, it's dark and edgy. It's not. It's a fundamentally reconnecting, to my mind, with what it means to be a living, present, daimonic human in an ecology of daimons. So I don't have another two, because I think everything flows from that. That the small movements are the most important. The small moments of silence, of darkness. Yeah, you say darkness. Chthonic stuff is not dark in a, oh, spooky ooky. It's going into the cave and allowing from silence, as I put it in the book, poetry proceeds from silence. You have to be silent before you can train yourself to speak. And the big assumption is, if I speak and use the right words, the right holy names, then it'll all work. No, be silent.
Well, with the risk of violating that premise of being silent, Craig, I'd say biggest misunderstanding, the one that springs to my mind, Alex, is people confusing things to be complicated versus complex. Complicated as in the car engine is complicated, and it takes a long time to study how to build a car engine. But once you've studied it, it's codified, it's clear, you can do it. And maybe if you're good enough, you can even twist and tweak it a little bit and you'll make it better. But traffic patterns are complex. They're very different from car engines. Traffic patterns are very hard to predict. They're sporadic. They're multi-leveled. The way smoke rises from a cigarette is complex. It's very hard to predict how this will happen. And so to have a sharp lens on your own practice. What in this practice is complicated and what of it is complex? And wherever things are complex, we're talking about relationships. We're talking about actually zooming in and the moss kissing the lake. When it's complicated, instead, you don't need to use all of that. You just need to find the right logic. I'll give you a very practical example. I was at a cemetery earlier this year, and there actually happened to be an old open grave, and I was able to pull out a skull. And I was like, man, this is like totally dreamlike. I would have never thought to be able to go through such a necromantic act in bright daylight with nobody around me. So I left the skull in the grave. But of course, I had this itching, do I take it home? After all, the skull and I encountered each other and we met kind of at the cemetery, and that was rather unpredictable. But I was going backwards and forwards, whether that be a smart idea or a really stupid idea. Is it complicated or is it complex? And as I do when I'm stuck in these moments, I call good friends. So I called Josephine. And said, Josephine, what do you think? Do I take the skull home or, do I leave it there? And Josephine took a deep sigh and said, Acha, when you meet someone interesting on the street, do you pack them into your trunk and drive them home? No, you don't. You're just happy that you met someone interesting. So leave the freaking skull in the grave. And that's what I did. So apparently that was not a complex problem. That was, at least for me, a complicated one. And luckily I had smarter friends than me who cut through it.
I can hear Josephine's voice resounding as you say that, Frater Acker. That is...
While she was headbutting herself on the table, like, why the fuck is he asking me even this? Is he so stupid?
Right, exactly. Yeah. That is so lovely and a perfect demonstration for both of you together, yourself and Craig, and what you shared with Josephine, Frater, is relationships. I know that listeners will really appreciate seeing that kind of dynamism of your relationship in Goetic Atavisms, but also just in this conversation, it really does come across. Given that you have this amazing collaboration together with Goetic Atavisms, in addition, both maybe future collaborations and independent projects and things that you're looking at, can you share a little bit about ways that listeners can support your work, of course, by picking up a copy of Goetic Atavisms, but what are upcoming projects, topics, just what are you both separately and collectively thinking about just going forward in the esoteric space?
Well, I know that sounds terribly arrogant, but my work doesn't need support. The work is the work and it needs to come out. And if it's not interesting to people, then it's not interesting to people, and that's perfectly fine. So nobody needs to worry about that. I think hopefully the book, will be relevant to people. Hopefully it will allow them to, have some intimate experiences, rethink their relationships in magic and possibly beyond that. Craig and I were chatting. This was such a fantastic experience and also so, erotic and fluent, at least on my end. It was very essential. Yeah. I think there might be a second book in the same vein because we're touching on a lot of things in that first book that I think are incredibly foundational. But since we finished writing that book, earlier this year, I've come across so much more material that really speaks the same language, that really speaks from the same place and wants to be expressed. So on my end, I feel like we could have probably waited another year and then the book would have been double in size. Or, we just felt, okay, this is a good first chapter or body of work. Let's get that out and then see what comes next.
Yeah, I would agree on that one. I mean, back and forth some other essays in the intervening time, because obviously we started this in September of last year and it's now May. So books take time. But yeah, and I would also echo it doesn't need support. And again, that's not arrogance. As I say in the book, it will bounce off people. It genuinely, I know for a fact that at least my section will bounce off people, right? And that's part of the point, because this is a grounding for me. When I was writing this, I was like, I need to expose people to this way of thinking first. I need to expose people to this way of being in the world, because not wanting to toot my own horn, but there's not many people writing about the ins and outs of disability in Magic. I've written some stuff that have been in the Fenris Wolf, in that journal. I've written other things for anthologies over the years. I think I'm mostly the only one writing publicly about it. And I'm going to keep, taking that angle, not in a making everything more accessible, although that has its benefits too, but also suggesting that there are other ways of doing this. But again, going back to potentially that second collaboration, the book is written as almost a way of capturing and manipulating attention. All writing is that, yes, but deliberately directing attention to the cracks and pathways in Western occultism and going, hey, let's poke these cracks, because I don't think they're discussed, because they generate awkward questions. They genuinely generate awkward questions as to what's the place and who do we consider human, who do we not consider human, what's our responsibility if we live in an ecology of living daimons? Do we have a responsibility to them? Do we not? All these things are things that I am constantly thinking about, because it's my life. This is the world in which I'm embedded. So I'm constantly thinking about this. And yeah, there's more material. And when Acher is less busy, maybe the cycle will begin anew. But certainly, I think my key point is that I will continue doing what I do. I will continue working within the various currents that I'm involved, whether that be locally or within things like the Cosmic Gnosis or other things like that, because the important bit is the work. The books, the things we end up sharing, that means nothing without the actual work, and that's one of the big problems, and probably why I haven't published material in this degree, because the work is more important.
I want to mention one thing, what you just said, your essays, you said, my bounce off people. I think what you wrote and what I wrote is so distinctly different and yet connected. When I look back at my own part of the book after I had read all of yours, I felt mine was really simple-minded. Mine was like, okay, if I say this is practice, it's practice. Now you're meant to practice what I've just said. And when I say this is theory, then I'm just trying to explain to you how to think differently about things. And that's really it. It's very straightforward. But when I read your essays, in particular, I think the second or the third one, it just worked in my mind like a fucking drug. Like, it really was mind altering. It really got under my skin. So I would recommend for people, if indeed your essays were bouncing off because they're approaching them through the same lens that they might have approached maybe my writing, approach Craig's work as if you were drinking a mind-altering substance. Stay with the words. Don't try to understand every single word. Let them flush over you and into you and sweep into your body and see what it does. Like, read them before falling asleep. And I promise you'll have awesome dreams. It's very different approaches and very different turns on this Goêtic idea.
I would say, always remember Ala Paracelsus and others, that the difference between poison and remedy is purely in the dosage.
Exactly.
The encouragement to put the chalice of intimacy to our lips and to take very big gulps, I think, is just so lovely. Are there any final parting words or anything else that you'd like to share with listeners who definitely will be picking up a copy of Goêtic Atavisms, but just about anything else you'd like to leave listeners with?
Honestly, Alex, I feel we're still going through very wild times. When I look at my social circle, maybe at work or privately, I'm surrounded by people who are having really rough times for various reasons. Maybe we all turned out a little bit with thinner skin after the pandemic. I don't know. It doesn't matter. It is what it is. So I think my hope or wish will be, be gentle to yourself. Do not have any heroic expectations of what tomorrow will bring. Be kind to yourself and, enjoy the adventure for as long as it lasts.
Yeah, I'd echo that. And also, I think it's something I wrote yesterday and I've been thinking on is that I want to encourage people to be like, quite frankly, the reason you are here is to be you in the most complete way possible, and be gentle with yourself and allow yourself to experience yourself in all your depths and all your heights, right? So if you have these bad times or these good times, experience them. Don't try to exhaust yourself pushing them away. Instead, spend some time reflecting on yourself as if you're moss, and ask yourself, how would I treat a valuable piece of moss, rather than perhaps how might I treat a human.
Our guests today have been sharing about the importance of throwing away the lights and the definitions and going back to that essential intimacy, that arcane and yet totally immediate sense of embracing paradox, embracing ambiguity, gently surfing those waves, and to consider moss and lake in very intimate ways as well. Their latest book is Goêtic Atavisms. Check out the podcast and video description below to definitely pick up your own copy. Frater and Craig Slee, magicians, practitioners, authors, people who are sharing their decades of wisdom. Thank you both so much just for taking some time and coming on the podcast today. Really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure.
Listeners, what's not to deeply contemplate and deeply integrate with the wisdom shared by Frater and Craig Slee? I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Their invitation to develop an erotic connection with the spirits, to cultivate intimacy and receptivity, and to not become focused on repeatability, but instead to focus on cultivating long-term relationships with spirits. Those are all things that I hope we can deeply bring into our own practices, and to realize we are not magicians sitting in an empty room if we're not doing rituals, but rather that reality is teeming with these spirits if we but have the patience and the sincere receptivity to cultivate those connections. Thanks so much to Frater and to Craig Slee, and to every single podcast supporter on Patreon. And if you would like exclusive content and perks, and you want to put up with an incredible amount of nerdiness, please head on over to patreon.com/glitchbottle, and I'll see you there. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.